So it's the moment you've all been waiting for. It's the compliance presentation. I'm Paul Fothergill. I work in Sesame Bankhall Group in the compliance department. Sesame Bankhall Group consists of the Sesame Mortgage and Protection Network, Bankhall Support Services, and PMS Mortgage Club. I've got a few things I just wanted to highlight to you today around compliance at the moment in this current environment, and then a couple of other things around file accuracy and also around financial crime. So let's get going. So I've got a thrilling compliance presentation for you today. Before we get started on that, I just wanted to briefly talk about compliance and coronavirus. So COVID-19 has changed a lot in our day-to-day lives, the way we go about various things. But in terms of compliance, it's still the same things to be looking out for. The FCA are still interested in the same key points around making sure that customers are being treated fairly, that they're put at the heart of your business, that their needs and circumstances are considered, and that the products that you recommend suit those needs and circumstances. One thing that the FCA has expressed concern, particularly in around COVID-19, is that firms might be doing some things to undo the good work that they've done over the last few years as a result of a downturn in business, so that they're putting potentially getting new business ahead of treating customers fairly and considering things like remuneration and making sure that's appropriate. So that's something to be aware of. And additionally, they're a bit more up on vulnerable customers at the moment because they consider, as we'll see shortly, the number of people who are potentially vulnerable is higher as a result of COVID-19. Anyway, on with the presentation. So the first thing I wanted to talk about today was vulnerable customers. So the FCA issued a consultation on this back in July, and that's the second guidance consultation on this subject. So they're taking this quite seriously. The guidance set out in that paper is likely to come into force as it's written because it's the second consultation on this piece already. So the FCA want to see vulnerable customers being treated fairly and consistently across financial services, with previous FCA research indicating the top stat on the screen there, that around half the UK population has characteristics of vulnerability. And they've speculated that the coronavirus pandemic is likely to have increased that number as well. So the reason they're taking it seriously is because of the large numbers of people that it could potentially affect. So what does that the FCA actually mean by vulnerable customers? So vulnerability can affect anybody at any time in their lives. The FCA have identified these four drivers of health, life events, resilience, and capability. So in terms of health, that's health conditions affecting people's ability to carry out their day-to-day tasks. It could be physical, it could be mental, anything really that can affect that. Life events, so major life events such as bereavement, job loss, or relationship breakdown. Resilience, low ability to withstand emotional or financial shocks, and then finally capability. So that's low knowledge of financial matters or low confidence in managing money. It could also include low capability in other relevant areas such as literacy or digital skills. And the key point really again is there's no specific type of person who could be vulnerable or is vulnerable. It could cover anybody. These things, as I'm sure when I was reading through them, you realise can happen to anyone at any time. So issues with your health, life events, resilience goes up and down depending on what's going on for yourself as well. It's really one of them things where we're not looking at specific individuals. We're looking at this could happen to anybody at any time, and that needs to be taken into account. So I wanted to briefly show you the FCA's confusing diagram on the screen there, which is only intended really to outline that a lot of the time there's overlap between the drivers. Some individuals touch all four vulnerable characteristics, as you can see in the centre of the diagram there. Some may touch just the one, some two, some three. It depends on what they've got going on in their lives at the moment. It's worth taking them into consideration like that. So what does the FCA actually want from yourself and from your firms on this? They want firms to think of vulnerability as a spectrum of risk, as you can see on the screen now, and to consider that customers with vulnerable characteristics are more likely to have different needs and are more likely to suffer harm if those needs are not considered. The FCA wants firms to recognise vulnerability and respond to customer needs. So it's not always easy to spot vulnerability. People aren't necessarily going to come into the offices or talk to someone on the phone and they're going to say, I'm vulnerable. Especially if they don't disclose it to you, it's not so easy to pick up. It's likely to be that you're picking up things through conversations with them, the old classic soft facts that you're getting these ideas that there may be something else going on that you might need to assist them with. It's about providing the opportunity for customers to disclose if they have any extra needs that you can assist them with, but it definitely isn't always easy to spot these things. The FCA have also said that they recognise that the value of sympathy, so firms having time to listen and think about what they might be able to do to help these customers rather than just sticking to rigid processes and hammering on through. Another point they've made is talking about empowered and knowledgeable staff. So making sure that if a customer has been identified, that's maybe noted down somewhere so they don't have to repeat it again. And if somebody else deals with them, they can work with them to address their specific needs around vulnerability. So that could look as well like having staff champions within your firm, sharing experiences of dealing with vulnerable customers among staff so that people get more ideas around what they can do. The final point the FCA made around what they want firms to do is addressing communication needs. So some examples of that could be using a larger font for people who maybe are not so good with their eyes, or providing a translated letter for somebody whose first language isn't English, that kind of stuff as well. For yourselves, it's not really anything majorly different on how you should be dealing with customers already, I would say. It's about looking at their needs and circumstances, but not just necessarily in relation to their final recommendation, but for the processes in between. Do they need some things in a slightly different way? Do they need a bit more time to consider the documents that you provided to them, that sort of stuff? So the only difference between a normal customer and somebody who's vulnerable is just thinking about adapting those processes and the approach to suit those specific needs. So moving on to file accuracy. So the thing to remember about this really is the case file that you're checking. Is it possible to establish that the recommendation was suitable from the information that's made available in the file? So the points we're about to cover, they're not particularly groundbreaking. I'm sure you've heard them before. They're things that do come up a lot during file reviews for the network or for clients of Bankhall. And they're things that could easily be rectified by checking through cases properly. So inconsistency is the first one. Making sure that the needs and the circumstances compare to the recommendation. Obviously, I don't mean tailoring the needs and circumstances to suit the recommendation, but inconsistencies cast doubt over the suitability of any recommendation. Common inconsistencies that we see in the network are retirement age differs across the file, as well as inconsistencies in the income reporting. So those cast doubt over the rest of the file and make it sometimes seem that it's not potentially like a sort of plausible recommendation that's being made. The small things that can easily be ironed out and confirmed with the customer to make sure the file is more accurate and appears to be more accurate as well. Moving on to the chronology piece, the order that the documents are completed and uploaded to whatever system you use is important as well. The way that in which the documents are presented, it can cast doubt again. If the recommendation is submitted before you know your customer, it looks a bit odd. It kind of looks like you've completed that part first before you're adding anything else onto the system. It's just something that again adds a little bit of doubt into the whole process. As you'll see later on when we cover some financial crime pieces, it's about making sure that everything adds up and is consistent and adds to the whole picture that the recommendation is a suitable one based on the information that the customer has provided to yourselves. So you'll be pleased to hear this is the final one of my slides. I'm just going to highlight some key things to look out for around money laundering and fraud. So the first thing to say is it's not always easy to spot these things. There are websites which you may have seen where you can buy all sorts of novelty documents that are incredibly realistic. Goodness knows what people are actually doing with these if they are using them for hilarious shapes with their friends. But they're incredibly realistic pay slips that you can get hold of that look very similar to some of the payslip processing systems that you will have come across, as well as hilarious documents outlining bank accounts from all of the high street banks and many more besides. And as I said, these are incredibly realistic. It's not as easy to spot that they're fake, but there are certain things that you can do. The most important really is to not just take things that the customer says at face value. So checking any information they give you where you can, and cross-referencing things like payslips and bank accounts, checking that the amounts that are on these pieces of paper add up and cross-reference each other. So what you're looking at to try and do is to build up a plausibility for the whole picture that the customer has provided to your firm. One of the most common things that's been seen over the last few years is staged income. So an example would be where customers recently started a new employment to supplement their existing income, or they start receiving a significantly higher income a few months prior to applying for the mortgage. Where you suspect that's the case, things that you can do are looking back and asking for some further payslips to confirm how long they've been receiving that income for. And again, it's really about that plausibility piece. Does this kind of make sense, or does it raise a few suspicions with yourself? Is that the kind of thing which makes you think, hang on, that's not quite right? When you're checking payslips, things to check out for: company name, the telephone number, checking company's house against those things, looking for inaccuracies or inconsistencies across the documents, any spelling mistakes. So a common area for errors that we see is around tax codes, particularly where there's a second job involved. The tax codes don't quite match up with how this should look with somebody who has two jobs. Where something doesn't look right, again, looking to try and get hold of further information to verify that the customer is telling you the truth and there's nothing dodgy going on there. The final piece I wanted to mention on the screen there is around conveyancing fraud. It's a low risk, high reward thing for scammers. I know it's not necessarily within your firm's remit as it's dealing with conveyancers, but it's definitely something that you can make your customers aware of to try and help cut down on this, because it has been on the rise in the last few years or so. So this is where scammers intercept the communications between the buyer and the conveyancer, convincing the buyer to transfer money into the scammer's account rather than to that of the conveyancer. It's definitely something worth mentioning to customers just to keep an eye out for, but there's no real reason to go much further into that. So I had a whale of a time presenting this fantastic information to yourselves today. I hope you enjoyed it as much as I did. It's always great to have a captive audience to spout compliance at. It's also encouraging to present online rather than face to face, because it's less off-putting when people get up in the middle of the presentation and leave, and it's also more difficult for you guys to heckle me. To summarize everything we've talked about today briefly, which parts of the presentation do you actually need to care about and to think about later on today? Vulnerable customers, have you got any processes in place for identifying them and for adapting your processes to make sure that you're taking into consideration their needs and circumstances? If it's not something that you do have, it's definitely something you need to think about, as it's something that the FCA are taking more and more seriously, and there are changes coming with the consultation that's out at the moment there. In terms of file accuracy, if you came to the file fresh without knowing anything about that particular case, would you think that the recommendation that's been made is suitable based on that information that is available in that file and knowing nothing else? It's really key. Can you put those pieces together to see that the recommendation is suitable? If it's doubtful, then you need to think about how you're presenting the information, if there's anything else you can add to that file. And finally, on fraud, is the information given to you by the customer plausible? Does it all add up? Do all the pieces, again, fit together to create that plausible picture that the customer is giving you? Don't just take things on face value. Do a bit more digging. Ask for more information where and when you need it. Those are the key things from today from me. Thank you very much.